there is anything which concerns us more right now than the corona epidemic. So, I know that just as an introduction for our listeners and everybody who is listening, Professor U.S. Vishal Rao, he has done his FRCS from Glasgow. He is also the Regional Director, Head, Neck and Surgical Oncology and Robotic Surgery. He's also the Associate Dean for the Center of Academics and Research, works at the HCG Cancer Center, and is a surgical oncologist who holds several important positions with the state and union government, member of consultative group, principal scientific advisor to PM, a WHO technical director for NCD in Karnataka, member of High Power Committee on Tobacco and Cancer Control, member NCD Task Force, member of the COVID Task Force Committee, and a scientist and an innovator with over 18 patents and 100 international publications in research. And that the last sentence is something which I always get excited about whenever I meet you, Dr. Rao, because I know that you are such a apart from being a regular doctor, you are such an innovative doctor. So to start with, Dr. Rao, tell us what is the real situation in the corona epidemic in the country and in Karnataka. I know that just today evening you had a meeting with the chief minister, and you are in constant touch with him, and you are really driving the force and the fight against this epidemic. So with all the conflicting news that is coming around from somebody says it's a small flu, somebody says it's a big disaster, what is the real situation on the corona epidemic?
Thank you, Karanveer, and thank you for inviting me for the show. I consider this an honor. I'm so glad that we are sharing these conversations today. So, the very interesting background about corona, if I have to introduce this virus, I will use the words of some of the very interesting things that have been described for this have been that this is a riddle wrapped in a mystery within an enigma. Nobody has fully understood this, and that is what today describes our situation. Globally, I don't think any country has got it fully right. Everyone, including the WHO, has somewhere gone wrong. They have been kind of mulling over certain policies, not been able to give a clear strategy. And that is what describes for us the current scenario. Now, having said that, there are certain basic facts that we need to take into consideration. One is that this virus is a very social virus. It loves socially mingling, and that's why we are performing the Social Distancing Act. It's a very social virus. The second thing is it's extremely good at hiding, much better than you in lockdown. So if you are in lockdown thinking that you are hiding, it hides better than you. The third thing is that it has got a crude fatality rate of about 3.5. So which means you can't ignore it. Now, that brings us to the question that what is our benchmark for comparison? The Spanish flu that hit us in 1918, 100 years back, when the social norms were 50% of what it was now, or maybe lesser, killed 200 lakh Indian lives. That is in 1918. So considering, and that time the crude fatality rate of the Spanish flu virus was at 2.5. So naturally we are dealing with a virus that has tremendous potential and cannot be ignored. Number one. Number two, I would like to say that when we initially started off, we said that we are different from United States. India is different from US. Now we are saying Karnataka is different from Maharashtra. I think that's not completely true. Remember that this virus has about 7 forms, of which 3 of them are lethal, 4 of them are not so much. However, that is for humans. But the background to the story is that these 7 variants are lethal and they have not become less virulent. So with this background, we need to give it the due respect which it commands right now, or it is demanding right now, in whichever way you take it. this virus needs to be given the due respect for it. And that is why the only current measures that we have in this are no treatments. And the closest we can get to a vaccine or a treatment, which we are all racing towards, is it looks like late 2020 or early 2021. So the next couple of months, we are left with the virus hanging dry, trying to figure out what we can do. And naturally, the process of exploration continues to go on. So we are at very interesting times. And I'm saying that Corona has taught us a lot of things. It has taught us a lot of brilliant stuff. It has taught us a lot of things through hardship. It has taught us a lot of things through through our difficulties. And those lessons is something that I would love to share with you all today, to actually give our audience a more broader perspective of what it taught us during this time, whether it was in science, whether it was in innovation, whether it was in understanding systems and machinery, whether it was in understanding the most beautiful lessons in terms of reverse mentorship, where the younger need to teach the elder. I think there are a lot of lessons that have unfolded in this particular conversations, to the extent that sometimes people who were dismayed went to ask whether humanity was the virus and Corona was the vaccine, to the extreme that people saw socialism, communalism, corruptionism, or capitalism brew while humanism was emerging. There were beautiful facets that we saw through Corona, very beautiful, fascinating facets that Corona brought out in the society. And one of the most fascinating lessons that I think I saw closely was that, I give this very simple example, Karanveer, that when somebody attacks me, and if I know karate, I can defend myself. But if somebody has come to attack me, I can't watch a YouTube video when he's standing in front of me and then say that I'll defend myself. Corona brought us to that particular brink. It taught us that we need to have better preparedness for disasters. For example, lockdown period, when the initial 21-day lockdown period was announced, we had set up an independent think tank with Justice M.N. Venkatachalaya, the former Chief Justice of India, as our chief patron and mentor, to initiate how we could actually come across through cross collaborations, cross expertise of scientists from various backgrounds and non-scientists, social experts, others coming together, or laymen, to understand what we could do to bring creative thinking into a collective independent think tank to work with the government. And we came across and gave a 3-week plan, a 21-day challenge, which said that the week 1 was the week of preparedness. That means you get prepared with detection kits, you get prepared with personal protection equipment, ventilators, medications, hospital beds. The week 2, you conduct a military operation. When you conduct this military operation should help you build a China wall between the positive and the negative. And in week number 3, you open the economy while stabilizing hospitals in such a way that the hospitals have beds and ventilators, and you open up the economy in a very secure way that there are 2 weeks of no positive cases. So which means 2 weeks we should have no positive cases and we open the economy. That would have been an ideal scenario. And what we all re-emphasized was that this is a war that should be won at home, not in the hospital. This is not a war to be won in the hospital. 12th of March, I was supposed to be in London. Michael Bloomberg was hosting the Partnership for Healthy Cities meeting, which was hosted by Dr. Tedros, the World Health Organization Director General, Michael Bloomberg, who is the United Nations UN ambassador, and by Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London. I was a speaker for that event. About a week before, I got a mail telling that I should continue my plans to come to UK, and that we were all on with a thing, and that we should continue to inspire the world by our continued commitment to health. Couple of days just before the event, we got to know that the health minister of UK was affected, and then the pandemic grew and the meeting got cancelled. But ever since, I've been globally connected with all experts across the world, trying to figure out what are the ways in which we can connect this whole thing, what are the ways in which global strategies have to come together, and how are we able to contribute and learn from each other. The one single thing that we have learned is no country has got it fully right. Today, even if you see the most advanced countries such as United States, the Jan 24th, the first case happened. There on Feb 24th, there were thousands of cases every day. To by March 24th, you had 30,000 new cases per day. So this was jumping logarithmically. Now that's because the R naught of the virus, R0 of the virus that we call is the reproducive capability of this virus, which we say is 2.5 roughly. So let's say 2.5 means that one person can infect 2.5 persons. But what we've not understood is that 2.5 persons can be per minute or it can be per hour based on the social norms. So when you slow down the virus, you're reducing the R naught of the virus through social distancing. But when you don't, that means, for example, the techie, one of the early techies who entered India, had infected 2,000 people before he got detected. So that's why this particular number is going to jump logarithmically and not linear. And that's the learning lesson we had to share. So a whole lot of spectrum of learning that we found. And I'm going to add one or two elements to this. The other very interesting aspect that we were confronted, and I'm aware that you are yourself having a biotech company, and you juggle two worlds. You juggle the world of information dissemination and the world of information creation. So which is very interesting blend for you. Now, when I went through it and playing so many roles in the government and outside the government, we were actually faced with very interesting things. And I'm going to pose a couple of questions and theories that we were going to ponder upon. And I think I'm going to broadly divide the next conversation of mine into three parts, which is science centric. The first, what are the changes we saw in science? What are the hurdles we saw in science? And lastly, what are the new messages we are learning in science? So there are broader lessons that we've learned in science, and I'm a man of science. And sitting in the epicenter of this thing, I found a very interesting observation, which we've just written a paper on. It's yet to be published, but it's under review in an international journal. But I would like to share that with the audience to kind of disseminate an kind of a thought-provoking question. So the former director of DRDO, Dr. Batra, who's been a colleague, a friend. We were working together with the ITBT ministry in the government of Karnataka, working on some of the concepts on the COVID virus. And one of the very interesting things that we came across was a strong theory that we observed. The mortality in India has been significantly lower. Now, when we dug up deeper into this, a very interesting finding came to light that many years before itself, before the human coronavirus entered into the system, stray dogs in India and roadside cattle were already harboring the coronavirus.
Oh.
The canine coronavirus and the bovine coronavirus were already being harbored by these stray dogs. And for some strange reason, there has been two similarities between the canine and the bovine coronavirus. That is, the ACE receptor in the dogs is similar to that in humans. And the spike protein that is there in the corona canine viruses is similar to that of the human virus.
Wow.
So we share a lot of similarities with them, and that's why there could possibly be a cross communication, across interspecies transmission that must have already occurred, that has given us some partial immunity that we have developed to this virus. That's both good news for us, correct? Because India is a house for about 3.5 crore stray dogs and about 15 crore cattle. So that has possibly, that's one of the theories. So when I actually discussed this theory with some of my colleagues abroad, like in the Emory University Vaccine Center and others, they did agree with this, and that they said that this actually could be a strategy for actually us building vaccines. So a lot of things have come out through these sessions of discussion and collaboration. And what Corona, I think, brought to the limelight or the forefront of our discussion at the time of this pandemic was the message that we should use the message of collaboration and not competition. And that's what it brought to us. Another very interesting thing it brought to light is that at this very interesting time, it showed us that this is the juncture at which science contracted. So I was talking to the LGVS team. The LGVS had partnered with us to become our academic and research clinical partner for COVID. And they would actually bombard us with a lot of research. And I was talking to the LGVS team, especially, I think I would like
Which
to
is this team?
acknowledge
Sorry, LG. What is this?
LGVS publication, which handle the Lancet Resource
Oh, okay, okay,
Center and
yeah.
all the renowned publications of the world.
Nature and all.
They had partnered with us,
Mhm.
not Nature, but Lancet Research Center and the Lancet Journal, the Lancet Medical Journal, and all the other reputed medical international journals comes with LGVS publication. So they had partnered with us to give us all their research center to bombard us with a lot of learning and knowledge. So we would spend sleepless nights reading, understanding, upgrading our knowledge, interacting with experts. So it taught us a lot of lessons at that time. And we were discussing with the LGBS team. I would like to especially acknowledge Ujjwal and Hema for their contributions and support that they did during this time. So one of the interesting things that we came across was science from bench to bedside would take nearly 17 years. So if you see the bench side, which is the lab research, to then it goes to clinical research, and from there it goes to guidelines, and from guidelines it goes to clinical practice.
Absolutely. I mean,
This
I run
particular
a biotech company, and I've also been questioning this thing. How do we make a vaccine in 8 months? Because bench to bedside normally for all our products is around 15 years standard, or 15 to
absolutely
17.
absolutely. So now 17 years is the speed of this. Now time contracted, and this has become 17 days almost. I mean, I'm just saying, to get the ball rolling. So what we did see during the corona time was time contract without cutting short the important elements of research. So what created the research and the clinical hyperloop was innovations blended into it. Research has always been disconnected with innovations, but corona times actually brought innovation and the clinical hyperloop blended with innovations. I think that's the exciting thing that we observed during this period, that we saw this hyperloop being created because of the fusion of innovation with research and clinical work, and that kind of brought about a complete new understanding in these perspectives. Naturally, I don't say this is evolved, but I'm saying that it has given the thrust to it. It has given the initial jolt to recognizing the need for such kind of a hyperloop. And when I used to interact with the top regulatory teams, I used to understand from them that they are also enjoying this, because many of them would otherwise never see the light of the day for some of the products that they actually gave permission for, understanding its potential.
No, absolutely. I
So
mean,
today
being in
they are saying that they're
biotechnology, one team starts something, and then it probably they never see the light of day. After all, 1 in 10,000 molecules only make it to any kind of clinical trial, success. So
absolutely.
you're totally correct.
So it's been a very fascinating learning on how time contracted and research, innovations, and clinical practices fused together, to the extent that it looked like the bench was next to the bedside in COVID. And so these are some of the fundamental things that of status quo that COVID has broken. The fundamental status quo in terms of research and innovations.
So
And I
you
think
So you really got some interesting points. I mean, the fact that stray dogs and cattle could contribute to our, increased immunity is something which, frankly, even being a biotech person, I had never heard of before. And so what about all those theories of, having tulsi and uh, all those recipes which are floating around the internet and WhatsApp, and right from inhaling pressure cooker, water
yeah,
vapor and hot water for 2 days, and everybody comes. So, I mean, what is what would you say to all that? Didn't that make any difference? I mean, not the crazy ones, but at least the Ayurvedic ones, curcumin, turmeric, because that's what they were attributing it to earlier. That our increased ingest, usage of curcumin and these kind
Even
of
including, very interestingly, Karanveer, everything in under the sun, including the sun, has been offered as a solution.
yes,
Several presidents have contributed to the scientific knowledge of the expansion of experiments, you know, on what you could do to experiment to treat COVID, but it has not been true. The one thing that we know, and I had again published a paper, I'm going to share that paper with you. I'm going to share both the papers of ours with you. I had shared the paper on this, which is currently published in one of the international journals and is an accepted hypothesis. So what we did was we found out that people who are younger, that is the children, the kids who have a more immature immune system, are not succumbing to the COVID infection, but the elderly with a more mature immune system seem to succumb to the infection. And when we actually found about this and we dug deeper, we actually found out a very interesting synergy that it's related to the thymus gland. The reason is that thymus is the flash drive in our body that maintains the memory of the virus. Now, post 60 years, the thymus gets involuted and degenerated, and that's why you see them that the 60 plus people seem to be the most vulnerable with comorbidities. And that is the one single group that is seeming to be the most concerned right now in COVID. And that's the funny part that COVID is doing, that although being a communicable disease, it's specifically targeting non-communicable diseases. And we seem to be only running behind the communicable part. I was talking to our health minister and interacting on a very interesting note. And I was telling him, sir, look at this. Nobody has understood this paradox that this communicable disease is fundamentally hunting down the non-communicable diseases. And in this bargain, we've ignored the non-communicable diseases and everybody is focusing on the communicable disease. It's holding and hitting us on the blind side. So what if we had to look at strategies like reverse quarantine, which means that we know today's data that it's the younger who are more commonly affected and more vulnerable, and it is the elderly who have a poor recovery rate and who are having more fatality. So we need to protect the elderly, we need to protect the comorbid. I used to have patients in my OPD in the last couple of days who told me that their HbA1c is as high as 13 and they've not been taking their diabetic medications or hypertensive medications correctly because they're worried about coma, so they about COVID, so they did not go to visit hospitals. That's the kind of imbalance COVID created to actually make them vulnerable.
no, I'm sorry, but I totally, feel in some of my conversations with my fellow scientists and people that Corona has not killed as many people as probably, the people have not gone for their checkups. Cancer patients have not gone to hospital. They have not had their biopsies done. Tuberculosis patients have not collected their medication in probably villages. So that kind of survey has absolutely not been considered as to how much, non-corona impact fatalities have happened.
Mortality.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I totally agree with you.
Yeah. So that's the background with which we are learning to say that we need to now incorporate algorithms of reverse quarantine in our approach, which is going to protect us. So that when the younger people who are running the economy are going to go back, they don't infect the elderly and become the cause of deaths of elders. So that's the kind of strategy we propose. So we actually wrote a paper on this with the Harvard Public School, one of the experts, Dr. Deepak, to actually bring about some messages on this, to say that we need to give out larger messages on this. And I think the other aspect that we both again earlier discussed was how do we maintain productivity in the time of Corona? Because the one thing that we know that Corona is going to leave us with is a psychological impact, a behavioral impact, and an economic impact. These are three things that it's going to scar us with, that is going to be left with us. Psychologically, you see the way, whether it's healthcare or non-healthcare, it's been devastating psychologically. Whether it is going to be depressions, anxieties, worries, whether it's going to be extremes of psychological statuses with the diurnal variations, it's led to that. It's led to more amount of people.
Even domestic violence. No one has considered the cases of domestic violence. In fact, there is a strange scenario in which some of the builders, I can't remember, major builders of Bombay, they say there's going to be a greater demand for 1 or 2 room homes because a lot of the joint families who have stayed together will want to actually separate out in terms of your psychological effects
Absolutely,
on people.
absolutely. So these have been profound. So the social determinants of health have been very, very deep rooted, and that is what Corona has brought out the worst among those in these particular times. Like you rightly said, if you see the behavioral impact, our behaviors have changed forever. While we seem to be getting distance with technology, Corona seems to have furthered it even more. Our personal contacts have further reduced. Our social distancing has seeming to be more increasing, and that has led to a deep behavioral change in the way we socially interact for the
In,
future.
in fact, I feel that even some of the suicides we are seeing right now, like for instance, even like Sushant Singh Rajput and all these kind of suicides which happen. It is totally a non-clinical, opinionated thing, but I feel that probably to some extent the social distancing and the isolation contributed to all these uh, depression cases, which resulted in.
Absolutely. In fact, that's another aspect of it. So psychological and behavioral impacts of COVID are going to be significant, severe, and something concerning us globally. So since you brought out the topic of suicide, and since we've talked about Sushant, I think I wanted to give a specific message here. It's a well-known thing, and with several research papers published, that suicide is a social epidemic. The more you talk about suicide, the more people try to emulate and try to become copycats, especially when you have somebody who's having a more stronger personality and a social presence.
No,
So I have
absolutely. I have read like there's a lot of psychology which says monkey see, monkey do. So if you talk about it, then it is it is tend to be replicated. People unconsciously in their
absolutely,
subconscious mind, they tend to, without realizing that
absolutely.
they're replicating something, they tend to replicate the actions which they see in the papers, and they feel that it is suddenly a justified action.
So when Marilyn Monroe committed suicide, the national death rate shot up by 12% in US. So this is why it's very important for us today to not go and overdo social messaging on the suicide aspect of it. While we pay our condolences, we are seeing a whole lot of Bollywood pseudo condolences happening. We are seeing a whole lot of pseudo debates happening. I think that needs to be clipped, because people need to understand the health impact and the seriousness with which we are dealing with this whole thing. That's very crucial at this juncture. And the third thing is economic impact. I think economic impact of this is going to be totally devastating. I know for a fact, I've been talking to people at Harvard and several other universities across the globe. On the economic impact of this is going to be completely unnerving. Now, this is something that I said that these months are going to be the months of salary cuts. The next months will be the months of job cuts, and then we'll have pockets cut. This is going to happen if we don't clip down, if you don't salvage it, because we've already been in a wavy economy, we've already been in a vulnerable state, and this was just the wave that was waiting to hit us to completely sabotage basic foundations of economy. And that is what happened in many places. So we will need to bounce back a complete new way, Karanveer. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be a difficult time. And from close corners that I'm watching it among people, I know it's been a concern. And we'll have to pray and hope that new ways emerge and economy booms back. But it's going to be some time before it does so. And till that time, we need to just keep fingers crossed to wait for a miracle to happen. And I think countries across have been talking to ministers from across various corners of the country. I have been telling them that, look, I know it's a difficult time. I know there is only two wrong choices to either one of them is going to impact the other. So we know it's not been an easy decision. So I cannot be sitting on this side of the table and telling him wo galat kar raha hai, because it's not easy to be them at this point. This is the worst point in time that any politician could be holding the fort for his state or country. It's not easy. And all that we can do at this time is to be playing the role of a participatory democracy, joining hand parties together and moving beyond socialism, communalism, corruptionism, and capitalism to emerge with humanism. That's very crucial at this juncture.
But coming back to Corona, I mean, do we need to worry? I mean, is there a ray of hope, or I know you spent the last 15 minutes telling me about all the papers, but in brief, are we like, is doomsday approaching, or is the sunrise approaching? I mean,
See,
what do you think?
the obvious trends are looking like the sunrise is approaching, but the sunrise will approach at a cost, because it seems to me like with the unlocking we have accepted that we cannot build the China wall of the positive and negative. We cannot build it. So that is a state of acceptance we have reached right now, to say we will not be able to build the China wall where we completely separate the positive and the negative.
But are you happy with the medical facilities? Though we have the Arogya Setu and all that, but do you think that people are being like serviced when they feel sick, or do they know where to go? Do they know which hospital to go to? Do they know the course of action? Is that clear among our society?
So broadly, currently, when we look at this problem, like I told you, suddenly Corona, I gave you the karate example. And I'll tell you that we were not ready for such a kind of a disaster management drill. We don't have a disaster management drill, more so in healthcare. Number one. Number two, state is a health subject. So the central government can give advisories, give guidelines, but yet it is going to be the state machinery and leadership that's going to run it. So this is what we call the pandemic protocol, which means in a pandemic protocol, you follow with leadership from behind and let the scientists lead from front. That's what Karnataka did. A great amount of our ministers, our medical education, our health ministers stood behind and told us, go ahead and do it if you believe in this. I think that's the greatest support you can get. When your ministers, your bureaucracy is backing you and saying, go ahead, do this. We are with you. I think that's the kind of push you will need to change the game.
Yeah, but do our citizens, tomorrow, day after, if somebody gets Corona, what is his course of action? What is his 1, 2, 3, 4 steps that he needs to take? You please clarify over here so that people know exactly.
Yeah, number one, what we need to know is more than 80% of them are going to be asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic and are going to become all right on their own, which means 80% of our population has the power and the immune system to overcome the COVID virus. That has to be reassuring the people. Even if you get infected, you have to know that you're going to overcome this virus. 6% of our population of India is 65 plus, 6% only. So naturally, as a larger country, we've got more younger people than older people, and hence the long-term mortality that we are looking at within that 65 plus is going to be less. Number two, if you see Western countries and others, the comorbidities were extremely high. So if you are able to take care, and through your platform, if you can send out this strong message that people who have their non-communicable diseases, diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, tuberculosis, cancer, any other non-communicable, if they take care of it well, they will come out of COVID, even if they get infected. So with that, it leaves us to only 2% to 3% of the population who may actually be at life-threatening problem, for which we are working on plasma therapy, we're working on several other therapies to ensure that that doesn't happen. So on a larger note, I think we need to reassure our public that you need not panic. The systems are there. So the more you panic and hit the panic button, the more things are going to go wrong. Remember that state governments are working very, very eloquently, effectively, and with great amount of agility to pull off whatever they can in their best thing. And the private sector is coming together with NGOs and others to pull this together. So we are going to succeed in this.
But if a person does feel that he would like, are there enough tests in this, at least in the state of in Karnataka and Bangalore? Are there enough testing centers, or have you encountered complaints? And also, even within that, there are a lot of confusion going on. Somebody says that the tests are only 40% effective. There is even something going around saying that people are being unnecessarily put as positive, so that there is some kind of a connect between the hospitals and the diagnostic centers. So please clarify on all these factors. Firstly, what should a person do? Suppose he feels the classic symptoms of cough and fever and loss of taste and loss of smell. Where should he go next?
So if you see data that shows us that if you test all the people who have fever, cough, cold, only 2 to 3% of them have turned positive till now in for the coronavirus. So one thing is, yes, if you have fever, cough and cold, don't panic and think it's corona. Number two, typically people who have been infected with corona are people who have had fever and cough together. So this is very important for us to understand that at this juncture, we cannot panic on these grounds, but yes, we need to be very alert and agile. We need to be absolutely vigilant. Now that is very crucial for us to be vigilant, to understand that if there is slightest of these symptoms, we need to get our test done. But naturally, like you said, testing has been on the weaker side. That's because of the intrinsic, and takes me back to the old principle, what I told you about readiness from the government side, that we had to be ready. And the readiness showed us that we needed multiple PCR machines which were not ready. We needed after that a BSL-2 facility which we did not have. Then we had to ramp up the facility in such a fast way without the private sector being involved actively. And when the private sector got involved, it was a little bit too late. So there have been inhomogeneities in our actions with sluggishness and delays that have naturally compounded the progress. And that's obvious.
Why couldn't we learn from countries like South Korea, who have handled it extremely well? From what I hear, they are a model with drive-in testing facilities, and you just, even in Dubai, from the videos that I've seen, that you can drive in and they take a swab and test it and probably send
Agreed.
your test. So why can't we go on those models?
Broadly, yeah. So broadly, I would agree with you saying that, look, I think there were a lot of models that showed what they could do. But I think what we need to learn from this as a lesson is, look, what happened was a learning lesson for all of us to say that we are not geared for disaster management drills. We need to incorporate this into the system. We need to have a public health policy. We cannot take this lightly anymore. And that is one thing that I keep resounding and reiterating to say, that this has taught us this, that we needed to be ready. You cannot, like I told you, the karate, you cannot watch a YouTube video and say, I will follow Korea because Korea does that, because that does that every day. It doesn't do it on one fine morning, it does it every day. So all that they had to do was spin off the same thing in a faster way. But if you've never been used to it, and if you're going to start from scratch, that is to understand how many PCR machines are, you don't even have any data, you don't have a denominator. So that creates that kind of a panic drive, which no one single systems can drive together, because the each state government has a different way of functioning, a different machinery, different leaderships. And these are all things that count at this pandemic.
I mean, what do you think are now? You did mention some of them in the last conversation, but what do you think now are the two things? What is the optimistic and pessimistic scenario, and what are the treatment and treatment options which you think coming? Because, for instance, not to criticize anybody, but we have probably a slower decision-making process where the center would, we over-rely probably, and correct me if I'm wrong, because you are so much senior to me, but clinical trials are only accepted if they are done internationally, and then we wait for certain them to be approved by the FDA. We probably have lesser trust or something like that on our own trials, and then we have many centers of I would call it interest. You have the Ministry of Health, you have the drug drug controller, you have so many different centers. And when you go with a novel idea, when you go with a novel, uh, the decision making probably could be improved.
Absolutely. So what I learned through my own learning. So when I started this work, so I started two work. One is on plasma therapy and the other is on cytokine therapy. The cytokine therapy is something we built with our immunology team. So I had Dr. Jyotsna and Dr. Gurra. Jyotsna is one of the directors at ICREST, our immunology wing. She was one of the research associates with Ralph Steinman, the man who got his Nobel Prize for discovering the immune system. So when we put this thing together and when we started developing the cytokine therapy, we actually had to submit a 239-page document to the government to start the trial. So today, if you see, Karanveer, we've completed our animal studies. We've moved from animal studies to human studies. We've completed our phase 1 clinical trials, and we are now building phase 2. So we are at a very interesting juncture where we are building something, and we built this through lockdowns. And what we learned through this entire process was that, like, our trials are WHO registered, so they are in par with any international trial, following all the good clinical practices. That's the tough part, that we don't encourage research in our system, we don't encourage funding for research in our system. So that culture doesn't exist. Our culture exists more to copy and not to innovate and not to push for this, which is why we are facing that kind of a difficulty. So even for us it's not been easy, but I guess the last couple of years I've seen the system change in a good way to overall this and start to recognize these weaknesses, and systems galvanize to push this more stronger. So I'm actually happy in one way to say that yes, being a part of the system, I've seen that things are evolving, things are getting better. So that's positive. It
But
needs to be much better. It needs to have a long way still.
what do you think can be? Because I know, 15 years ago we had clinical trials was considered to be the next IT industry, and we had some 400 clinical trial companies in India and operating. And for some, a lot of reasons and just arbitrary rules and all that, and miscommunication from both sides, the medical side as well as maybe the governance. Now it came to a point where clinical trials companies literally, a lot of them have shut down, and from 400 to probably 20 or so. What can be done to improve the approval process or the examination process of novel ideas, so that they could be done quicker, faster, and better? We don't have to rely so much on only the FDA approving something before we approve it in India.
So, I've learned it the hard way, and I'm working on this because I see my plight as an innovator, and I try to encourage youngsters today. So what I give them is aspects of learning from what I went through to help them fast track this aspect. So one of the things that I realized is, so we have recently set up an independent ethics committee. That actually, because I've been a part of the ethics committee of ICMR, I also spearhead the ethics committee for the ITBT institutes, where I'm the chairman. So I understood that how research has to be inculcated into the system is going to be through a fast track process where we encourage them, help build synergies, help build the ecosystem for funding, so that we connect them in the right courses and able to quickly roll this out into a product. And that ecosystem currently is already building, and I'm now seeing so many foreign investors and experts coming together to encourage this, nurture and encourage and co-nurture this kind of an ecosystem. So we are at a very interesting juncture on this, but this needs to be into 100. I'm saying this is not good enough, but it's a good starting point. And that's the reason why I'm saying clinical trials and the thing, like you rightly said, the new hub got broken because the processes at the grassroots level were not strong. And the fundamental thing for that is because governments need to focus and fund research. And I'm not saying union government. Today we just can't say DBT, DST all the time. We have to look at state governments looking at funding research. What about, so we had a proposal in the Assembly of Karnataka, very interesting one, that talked about a small cess to be included into the municipalities to incorporate research and innovation in the municipalities. They called it as the as the cess to improve the scientific temperament of an individual. That's beautiful. I mean, this is what was discussed in the assembly on how do you improve the scientific temperament of an individual. That is the kind of things that state governments will need to promote.
So now, finally, I mean, we could go on and on, but of course, there's a barrier to time. But as a final thing, I'll just like to hop back to one of the what ultimately, where are we? Like hydrochloroquine seems to have been, it doesn't seem to have the results. I mean, it seems to have been deleted from the possible list of cures. Today there is some drug. I am not getting the name, but they say that that has been approved as one of the treatments. Are we anywhere closer? When do you think that we would see a reliable vaccine come out, which post phase 4 clinical trials would still continue to be safe and would not have adverse drug reaction, and or a reliable treatment program? When do you think it would be?
So it will be safe to bet and say that March 2021 is the time we're looking at that for a vaccine. And for a treatment point of view, like I told you, we are been one among the 100 plus clinical trials in this country, in this world, among which about 20 odd have looked at novel therapeutics, and ours is one of the only clinical trials that's looking at natural side effects. So we are currently collaborating with international organizations looking at building this. And I have completed phase 1. I'm entering phase 2 soon. So even I'm in the race against time, and I'm looking at seeing that I'll beat my own targets. But optimistically, vaccine looks March 2021. And from a treatment point, we are all racing against time. Like you said, 90% of us or plus will fail. But the point is, the only way to succeed is to fail multiple times and improve. And not the formula is not that we just sit down and say we don't start. So I think the final mantra will be remain productive, put your best foot forward, remain that you're going to be safe, understand that you're going to be safe, know that your immune system is strong enough to fight the virus. And if you have comorbidities, protect yourself and protect your elders.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Rao. That was absolutely inspiring and also encouraging. I hope that you succeed, because I know that you are an innovator and you have so many patents. So if there is one person whom I personally would depend on succeeding, I think it would be you and your team. So all the best. And, a lot of people have their hopes on you. We look forward to your succeeding, and thank you so much for the time that you've taken in,
Thank you.
Getting this out. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Karanveer. This has been a good opportunity for me. I'm thankful for you having invited me for this forum. I'm sure this is such a beautiful discussion. So many things comes out when we discuss and have relevant questions posed, and I'm sure that this will be, I'm at least hopeful that this will be useful to the audience who listen to it. I look forward to the feedback that you give me on this. I'm sure that is going to help us improve further.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Rao.
Thank you.